If you want music that sounds better and is more interesting to listen to, then one of the key components of accomplishing this is through dynamics. And in this video, I'm going to share 3 techniques with you that are simple ways to add dynamics to your music, and I use all 3 of these regularly. Though I will say that the last 2 are by far the best in my opinion, so you'll want to stick around till the end. Now, it would be easy to kind of just gloss over what dynamics are, but what are dynamics exactly? So simply put, dynamics are really all about volume and the change of volume in time throughout a song. So if a song is really dynamic, then that means that the song is consistently changing volume throughout the song. So verse 1 to chorus to verse 2 to chorus, you're gonna have varying levels of volume or dynamics. This is super helpful in making music more interesting because, probably not a big shocker, but music that stays at the exact same intensity level or the exact same dynamic throughout the whole song often will lead to a rather boring listening experience. And of course, there are genres where that is totally acceptable and even desirable. So like ambient music, for example, but even EDM or house or any other genre that some may say has little dynamic variation still usually has dynamics, it's just not quite as dramatic. So again, dynamics are the change of volume in time in a song. And generally speaking, music that is more dynamic tends to be much more interesting to listen to, which means you should probably take this seriously. So tip number 1, and the one that I recommend using the least or very sparingly, is automating volume. Let's just say that you have a piece of music that has relatively consistent dynamics throughout the entire track. How do you differentiate chorus 1 from chorus 2? Of course, my first inclination would be to simply arrange it differently, but let's just say that you didn't and you want it to feel more dynamic. Then what you can do is simply automate the volume of whatever elements you want louder to be louder or softer to be softer. Now, I'll explain in a second why this is not my preferred method, but it's still one that I use. This can help make things stick out a bit more and add more overall volume. The elements that I would typically recommend automating first to add dynamics to would be your bass, drums, and other primary elements that are more fundamental. The parts playing chords, the parts that are, quote unquote, holding the fort down. So you wouldn't necessarily be automating ear candy to be louder or more ancillary stuff, that little high guitar part or something. That's not necessarily what you're gonna wanna be boosting, but instead focusing on boosting the primary elements, maybe even your vocals. Now, the challenge with this is that it's very easy to overdo it. Meaning if you overdo it, it just sounds weird, it's rather artificial because all you're really doing is simply just increasing the volume of that sound after the fact. And if you increase it too much, it just sounds like a mixing mistake rather than more dynamic. So you have to approach this with a certain level of caution, because it can have an overall negative effect. You can also boost the entire mix bus. In other words, you can literally bump up the volume of the entire track in a chorus to make that have a bit more impact, but you're not gonna wanna push this beyond 1 or 2 dB, because again, if you push this too much, it's gonna sound weird, and it will also make mastering much more difficult as well, because it makes it harder to limit when the choruses are dynamically different when we're talking about automating the volume. Now, there is a difference between what I just said and what mastering engineers do in some cases, where they will actually automate the volumes, limit a little bit. Anyway, that's a little bit of a long story. We're not going to get into the mastering stuff. There is some wizardry that they use that kind of applies to automation. That's not what we're talking about. A little bit goes a long way in this particular technique. And that's pretty much it for this one. It's simple, just utilizing volume automation to bump up parts that either need more or need less. And now number 2, getting into the good stuff, perform more dynamically. And this one's really so often overlooked by amateur producers. I see a lot of this in my program, Producer Accelerator. We see a lot of people just not thinking about the fact that you can simply perform more dynamically. Oftentimes when we're in a studio setting, we're working with MIDI or working in small sections, chunks, whereas when you perform something live, it's all in one take, right? There's no stopping and tweaking after the fact. There's no punching sections in, which means when you perform live, it's actually much easier to think about performing dynamically because you are feeling the music in real time. So if you play drums, it is much easier to play that final chorus bigger because you actually have performed the whole song up to that point, which means you'll simply want that chorus to be bigger and naturally are probably going to play louder, making it more dynamic and making it more interesting. If you have MIDI parts, don't copy paste from section to section if you want more dynamic music. This is literally immediately guaranteeing that your music is not dynamic if you are doing that. And by the way, I'm not saying never copy paste, but you need to really think about it if that's going to work for you or work against you. And in most cases, I find it doesn't actually add that extra spark because it's literally not adding anything new. A big part of dynamics is not just volume, but also what little differences and nuances are you adding throughout. Now, while this overlaps with arrangement, which we'll talk about in a second, how you go about playing a part will impact the dynamic. So if you add a bit more rhythm in the second chorus, in the keys, for example, that's gonna add more dynamics, even though it's not just volume. So don't think that dynamics is just volume and nothing else, because other elements can impact the dynamics, or more or less maybe what we call perceived dynamics. Something that's more rhythmic will come across more often as more dynamic, even if the volume is the same. So it's not really just dynamics in the sense of volume, volume, but again, it's perceived dynamics. How your listener comprehends it is as more dynamic. If you have a guitar part, then you need to make sure that you are performing in the production in a way that is more similar to how you perform on stage in terms of dynamics, or really in an instrument, obviously not just guitar. I'm constantly thinking about the dynamic flow of my music. Now, a quick method of checking your dynamics is to make sure that as you are producing, you are listening to the whole track from start to finish as you make moves and be thinking, is this dynamically interesting? Because if you're just working in sections or in chunks like most people do, that's usually how I work as well, then it's very easy to just copy paste or perform things about the same in terms of volume, and then it's very easy to kind of just move along without actually thinking about dynamics. But if you're going back and listening and doing this frequently, start to finish, you'll find it's much easier to get a sense for the dynamics of the track, because dynamics is all about context. If you have something soft and then you have something loud, there is a contextual element of, hey, this was soft and now it's loud, or this was loud and now it's soft. So context is everything. If you're only working in a section, you're kind of missing out on the context. And do this often, because the further you get in the process of producing, the harder it is to make sweeping changes or redo things, because you'll start to feel like, well, you know, I already did that, I don't really want to redo it, instead of just getting it done right away. So some of this is just mental games you have to play with yourself to get better at having this at the front of your mind. And that brings me to my favorite, number 3, dynamically arranging. And then now I think I might have just made that whole thing up, but that's pretty much what it is. This is all about arranging in a way that is dynamic. And there are many, many ways of doing this, like many ways. And the easiest way to think about dynamically arranging is simply how much is happening versus how little is happening, or how many instruments are happening, or how few instruments are happening. That's just kind of another way of thinking about it, though they can oftentimes be different in practical application. An example would be verse 1, starting with no drums, no bass, just keys and vocals. Then halfway through verse 1, drums and bass come in. Boom, that by itself adds dynamics. Again, it has everything to do with context, right? Contextually speaking, we are hearing just keyboards and vocals, which is going to be soft, and then the drums and bass come in, and then now the context has changed. It's literally just arrangement. It's not necessarily even the performance of how loud are they playing, it's the arrangement. What things are happening and what things are not happening, and then what's the context of how we are weaving those things together. I'm using arranging to help reinforce or build dynamics. Now, by nature of not having bass and drums, it's just more quiet naturally. But once we add drums, the context changes and we now have more volume because we have a more dense arrangement. There's simply more happening. So when I'm arranging, this is a big thing on my mind. I'm mapping out the entire song and asking, before I even start, by the way, where is the biggest moment going to be? And where is the softest moment going to be? And a lot of times the softest moment is going to be, maybe in the intro or the first verse, or perhaps the bridge. Those are probably the 3 most common places you'll put it. It really doesn't even matter because you can find loads of examples of each. But the point is that there is a dynamically biggest moment and dynamically smallest moment. Choose those moments before you record a single thing, because those can serve a bit like a guiding force to help you make decisions. Otherwise, you might just be throwing things into your production without really considering the impact on the song from start to finish to the listener. If you're not thinking about this, then it's really easy to just kind of like do stuff. Oh, that sounds cool. And then you're not actually thinking about like, well, where am I going from here, right? If you start absolutely huge, that's a great idea to arrange in such a way that you place the biggest and softest moments very close to each other, because this gives a much larger dynamic jump that is extremely interesting to listen to. This is a fantastic arranging technique, and this has been used way before recording in the studio was a thing, by the way. Composers of old were using this technique, putting the softest and loudest moments side by side. Now, one of my favorite ways of doing this is by having a really soft final chorus to start, and then a few bars into the chorus. Usually it's going to be like 4 bars after one phrase. Make it explode. And that soft chorus is essentially priming your listener to experience a massive dynamic jump. Again, this is used all over the place. That has everything to do with arrangement. If you add, drums, bass, keys, vocals, and all that jazz in that final, kind of quote unquote soft chorus, even if you have those parts playing softly, that won't actually really be all that soft compared to just dropping to just keys and vocals, stripping the whole thing down, right? Having a single piano and vocals, and then make sure that the piano is performing a little bit dynamically softer, right? So when it blows up and everything gets added in, boom, that dynamic jump is really powerful. Think about how good it feels when you have a soft moment and then a massive bump in volume, like a big drop. That's the kind of moments that get us off our chair in a concert and make you get goosebumps. Why do you think that is? It's because of the context of how it's being done. It's when it's happening, soft and loud, boom, right next to each other. Now, the articulations of what your instruments are doing can also be another great way of arranging dynamically. Something loud that is plucked, or plucked with palm muted guitar or on the piano, is going to sound different dynamically, a little bit different than something that is loud and elongated. So you can have really loud palm muted guitar, but the moment you open up to full strums and also have it perform loud, that's actually going to come across as louder than just palm muted guitar. That's because articulation matters. How an instrument is arranged will really impact how it comes across to a listener. If you're changing up articulations throughout the song, that makes the song more dynamic, more interesting than just keeping it the same throughout. A really great example is acoustic music, acoustic tracks. If you have just acoustic guitar and vocals, it's really easy to make it really boring. It's just a fact. But you could try changing up the articulations. Maybe verse 1 is palm muted instead of strummed. Maybe verse 1 is finger picked instead of strummed. If you want simple things to be more dynamic, then try utilizing a more varied approach to articulation. Almost every instrument can be performed with various articulations. Like the piano, you've got the sustain pedal. That alone is going to change how the piano sounds. You can play long notes, you can play short notes with the pedal. That changes things. Or short notes without the pedal. All those variations change how that comes across. And by using many in the same song, you are increasing your likelihood of making it more interesting. Now, when it's all said and done, the skill of arranging is arguably one of the most valuable skill sets in all of production. The better you are at arranging, the more interesting your music will be, the more intriguing it will be, and the more dynamic it will be. So really work at improving your skills as an arranger. Now, if you think this video is good, then you should really check out my free workshop where I cover how I approach producing music from start to finish, my entire roadmap that I use. I have a link in the description down below. And it is also officially holiday season, so Producer Accelerator is 50% off. So if you've been on the fence, now is the time to join. I'll see you in the next video.